Welcome now to the last part of our lecture. As I mentioned to you earlier on, we're going to discuss now the empirical section of the paper of which we saw already the theory part. So the tenancy reform that happened in West Bengal, the Operation Barga. Let's talk a bit more about the reform, and let's now discuss a few more details of the empirical aspects. So first of all, remember that this operation happened in 1977 when a new administration came into power and decided to implement the existing law, which was around since 1950 something, 55 I believe. So the law was there, but practically what was happening is that was not enforced. So this is the operation of enforcing that law and making sure that all the tenants that could actually would register the land's right was called Operation Barga. And there's effects have been analyzed in the paper that we have already seen so far. According to the law, sharecroppers who registered with the government were entitled, as you probably remember, to permanent and inheritable tenure. On the land that they rented, as far as they met the one condition of pay to the landowner at least the 25% of the earth. So the reform did not impact the land distribution, but it changed the bargaining power of the sharecroppers because they couldn't be evicted by the landlord using as an excuse the low performance or the not paying of the rent. According to this reform, two effects can be immediately identified. First of all, farmers get a better share. So the famous alpha, 1 minus alpha that we have seen many times so far, the share of the crop that they could actually retain for themselves from the final outcome. Because whatever they used to pay before, which probably was actually much higher, now they just needed to pay 25% and keep the remaining 75% for themselves. In this case, in this way, we can say that more land and more outcome for themselves. If you remember also the rent equation, it says that once you have paid that part, this 25%, which could be considered like a fixed amount, all the remaining extra outcome could be kept for themselves. So this should increase the incentive to produce more, because in some sense it makes the sharecropping more similar to a sort of fixed rent, just because the percentage that can be used for retaining is actually much higher compared to before. So we should expect an increase in effort and therefore in productivity. The other very important element is that in this way, making the rights inheritable and permanent for the sharecropper, they know that now they can't be evicted from the landlord in an easy way, how instead will happen before. And therefore, in this way, this should increase the incentive to invest in the land, because now they know that whatever change, whatever investments that they can do now is going to benefit the heirs. So whatever children they might have, in the long run, they're going to keep the land for whatever investment has been made before. So in this case, that will make worth of investing in the farm. One thing that the researcher could not observe is how much this investment was, because this is something that they were not allowed to see. Well, it was not easy to record and keep track for every farmer. But the only thing they know is, first of all, what region the reform was implemented. And the other element that they can check is the average agricultural productivity. Now, with this information, and this is a sentence that comes directly from the paper, there's no way of knowing whether the reform worked because of the effect of the distribution of property rights or because of the existence at all of the property rights, because the only thing they know and they kind of get a proxy for is how many registration each area got. And they use the amount of registration as a proxy for an intensity of the program. So what they can actually do is to look at the total effect of the reform. So to look at this total effect without being able to disentangle whether there was an impact more of the distribution rather than the existence at all. So in terms of what we can empirically analyze, Operation Barga can definitely have an impact on the security of tenure, and that should, as we just said, provide incentive to make long-term investment in the farm, and for example, bearing a much higher costs on inputs that they before had incentive to do. And the other thing is that now, having a higher bargaining power so they cannot be evicted so easily, that also should translate in a higher effort, because now they're working as if they were, they were much closer to an owner-cultivated type of contract. So with the impact of Operation Barga, they check on the total welfare of the population that were impacted by the reform and on the productivity. How did they do that? They do that in a very, very clever way, because the research came much later on that the operation was implemented, and therefore the type of setting that an approach that they take is called a quasi-experiment, which is pretty much what we discuss in the Shaban paper as well. Think about what we said last week. The idea is that you have to find another group, another setting, very similar as much as possible to the one they are considering, West Bengal, where the reform was not implemented, so that they can approach the data coming from these two areas as a natural experiment, quasi-experiment, and therefore compare the productivity in both regions. So because this was this area was overall affected by the reform, they have to find another place, another area, which was as similar as possible to the area of West Bengal, but didn't get the reform. And this area was actually identified in the country of Bangladesh. Now, you might not know that prior to independence, Bangladesh and West Bengal were part of the same state in an undivided India. And apart from the boundaries and the religion, they have many things in common. They are very much similar. They have the same climate condition, they have the same technology, and therefore we can think that whatever shock or agricultural shock, weather shock, or productivity shock that might affect West Bengal would have also affected Bangladesh, pretty much in the same way. Both countries have a prevalence of the tenancy agreement, so we can consider the Bangladesh as being the control group of the treatment group represented by West Bengal. So, as I said again, I can't get tired to repeat that. It's a very clever idea, because basically provide for them a natural setting, because they didn't design the reform. The reform was implemented much earlier on compared to when they decided to check the effect of the reform, but they were design the collection of the data in a very clever way so that they could apply the experimental econometrics, which is very much similar to the one that we saw before, using the diff and diff estimator. So what is this model that they estimate? The author used data at district level, and they perform, as we just said, a diff and diff approach. So exactly as we saw for the Shaban paper, they're going to check the difference between the key variable obtained in West Bengal with the key variable obtained in Bangladesh, and see whether the difference between these two variables is actually significantly different from zero. In very few words, this is the nature or the intuition behind this econometric technique. So yes, the estimating equation, the estimated equation is provided by the log of y dt, where y represents the yields in the district time d at time t. Alpha d represents the district fixed effect, so any specific characteristic that might be going on in that particular area. Phi represents the time effect, because remember that the reform was implemented in 77, so whatever was before, all the data captured before, were not impacted by the reform. Then we have the treatment equal to 1 if the district, which is this one, if the district is in West Bengal opposite to Bangladesh, they will get a 0 value instead. Post equal to 1 if the year is the 1979 or later, so after when the reform was introduced or later. And X represents another bunch of control, such for example, the price of rice, real wages, rainfall, state roads, so everything that can affect productivity or the yields of this particular crop, which as far as I remember is actually rice. And we have to make sure that we control for all these aspects, because if any other difference that we may find will be then due to the treatment, meaning to the reform. The coefficient beta, which is this one here, represents the diff and diff estimate of the impact of the reform, which means that if beta is going to be in our data positive and significant, that will mean that the reform had a positive impact on the outcome, on the final outcome, which is the yields of rice. So what do they find? First of all, let's have a look to the data of the tenants' crop share and the tenants percentage of tenants in the sample pre and post reform. And as you can see, we have a higher share post the reform from 0.5 onwards. Looking at these two countries, you can pretty much see that up to 79, we can see that they are very much similar. There's not big difference going on between productivity yield per hectare in both countries. Whereas after the reform, we notice a drop of the West Bengal production at the very beginning, but then steady increase, much higher compared to the Bangladesh one. So we can see that it's like it took a little while for the reform to get implemented, probably something like 3 or 4 years. But then after that, up to 1993, so for the remaining 10 years, the West Bengal area performed significantly better compared to the Bangladesh production. And this table comes directly from the paper, is one of the many that you will find. As you can see, the dependent variable is represented by the effect of the registration on the log of rice yield in West Bengal between 1979 and 87, so a little less than 10 years. And what do we find? We find that the sharecropper registration, which is our variable of interest, is always positive because it doesn't have a minus in front of the coefficient. And the number of stars indicate how strong is this positive effect, meaning how much can we trust the result. 3 is the highest percentage, 3 stars is the highest level of confidence that you can get, 1 is the smallest that you can get. So as you can see, apart from these 2, we always have 3 stars, meaning that the results that we get is fairly strong, is very robust to the inclusion of extra variables. So as you can see here, there's no other indicator. Then we start to include other control, the one in the matrix X that we mentioned before, price of rice, rainfall, and then public irrigation, roads, all elements that can affect productivity of rice. Now, despite the inclusion of all this control, as you can see, the sharecropper registration continues to have a positive and significant effect in West Bengal compared to Bangladesh. What do they conclude? In the paper, they conclude that they find a significant positive effect. A 1% rise in the registration rate associated with 4% rise in rice yields, increase in the rice yields. The estimate is robust to the inclusion of all control, as we have seen by including other variables, the results doesn't change, slightly reduce the strength of the robustness, but not that much. And they conclude, therefore, that the overall effect of the Operation Barga on sharecrop productivity is about 50%. It's a huge amount. Basically, what they're claiming in this paper is that if you are able to increase the level of rights, if you make the rights on land transferable, inheritable, permanent for a family, for a household farmer, the increase in productivity is huge. And this is without any change in production technology, without changing any the amount of fertilizer, the amounts of seed. This is what I want you to, this is something that I really would like you to remember. This is the power of incentives in numbers. So whenever you can, with contract, change the incentive that a farmer can have in producing, it will change completely the way in which relates to the farm, the amount of effort, the amount of investment he can make. If the farmer feels that the land is becoming his own and he can not only benefit him, but also his children in the long run, the way in which they approach farming as a whole changed completely. And the results on the productivity that they estimate are incredibly big. So all the theory that we have seen so far, all the way in which you can change incentive, we will see some application in the tutorial to make you realize the change in number, how does it work, can be in some sense summarized by this 51%. Is a huge number. So I hope that you will take with you the idea that with contract theory, because people respond to incentive, you can simply alter the way in which they behave. Changing the behavior, change the productivity, and if you change the productivity, you're going to have long-term consequence, as we will see in the next lecture, and probably you will see also in the second part of the module even more on long-term growth. So this is a very powerful result, I would say. In the next lecture, we're going to see how eviction rate, so something that revolves around the possibility of not being evicted, kicked out from a piece of land, can change the way in which people approach farming as a whole.